Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Tuesday Talks here at Cure. I'm Seema Kumar, I'm the CEO of Cure, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to this particular Tuesday Talk. And we have the pleasure actually of speaking to Nolan Townsend. He's the CEO of LEXEO Therapeutics, and it's a company that's based here, right here in the Cure building, and they're doing some exciting work on Alzheimer's disease and cardiovascular disease using gene therapy as a platform. And so we're looking forward to discussing this with Nolan. So a little bit about Nolan. Nolan has served as the CEO of LEXEO Therapeutics and a member of the board of directors since 2020 of January. And it's a clinical stage biotechnology company, as I said. And prior to LEXEO, Nolan has worked in roles as president of Pfizer Rare Disease in North America region, president of Pfizer Rare Disease for the international markets, and also has worked at Lehman Brothers, advising healthcare companies on strategic financing transactions, mergers, and acquisitions. And you also serve on the New York City Economic Development Corporation board, and also you are the chair of the Life Sciences Cares here in New York. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here, although it's not that far from me, obviously being here in the building.
Yes, I'm so thrilled actually that we're having this conversation. So even though we interact a lot, we haven't actually sat down and talked about the work that LEXEO is doing. And so I want to first start by you telling us a little bit about yourself and how you founded this company with Dr. Ronald Crystal and what you've learned from being here in this building at Cure.
Yeah, so it's an interesting story. I mean, maybe not uncommon for the biotech field that an academic scientist and someone with business experience get together and form a company. But my background, as you mentioned, I spent a number of years at Pfizer across a variety of roles. The last few were roles in the rare disease business, as you mentioned. And through that role, I had some involvement in some of the gene therapy work that Pfizer was doing at the time. And I found the science to be very compelling. I found it to be the type of technology that could really change the healthcare system and could really change society, and we can talk more about that. So I was very enthusiastic about the future of gene therapy. And I met Ron Crystal at this point about 4.5 or 5 years ago. And I knew him to be one of the leading academics in the field. He was involved with dosing the first patients with gene therapy utilizing a virus in the early 90s, and he's been involved in several other milestones in the field since then. And he'd accumulated this very interesting pipeline of gene therapy programs in his academic lab. I'd say interesting for a few reasons. One, just the pure number of programs, in that there were 18 programs sitting across 5 different therapeutic areas, but also the target of the programs was interesting in that he had some programs focused on rare and ultra rare monogenic diseases, which is where most of the gene therapy field is focused today. But he'd actually begun to apply gene therapy to non-rare hereditary diseases. And our APOE4 Alzheimer's program is an example of that. So I could kind of see the evolution of the gene therapy field from the ultra rare and rare monogenic diseases where it's focused today into larger indications. And that was sort of the common vision we had for the development of the gene therapy field. So I think we came together at that point to form a company around these programs. We decided to focus on 2 distinct disease areas, which was genetic cardiovascular diseases and central nervous system diseases, which I know we'll spend some time talking about today. We've since raised 2 large financing rounds. We've grown the teams pretty substantially, and we've had some exciting progress on the clinical side. So it's been an exciting journey.
That's great. I'm going to come back to the financial rounds and some advice you might have for other emerging entrepreneurs. Sure. But before we do that, tell us a little bit about what it's like to be here in the Cure building.
Well, it's an exciting place. One of the things that was important to me was for the company to be in a biotech ecosystem in New York City. New York is a growing and expanding sort of biotech market. And I think we felt it would be very attractive to employees who are leaving larger companies to come and be in an ecosystem where they could share knowledge, experience, and also just feel some semblance of camaraderie with their colleagues and other biotechnology companies. So I think at the moment the Cure is the preeminent biotech ecosystem in New York City. All of the events and speakers, I mean, this has all been great for our team members to be a part of it. So it's been a really great experience so far.
That's great. Wonderful to hear. So, as you mentioned, you have had incredible success raising 2 large-scale financial rounds. So give us some advice. first of all, on the unique financial climate that we're going through right now, and how other founders can, do the same kind of raising capital like LEXEO did. What advice do you have for them?
Yeah, so I think when we first started raising our first financing round, this was pre-COVID, a few months pre-COVID, and so a lot of it was in person. We then went on to raise our Series A during COVID in 2020. We raised our Series B at the tail end of 2021, which was still, in COVID. So I think things, pretty materially transitioned from in-person interactions with investors to more virtual interactions, which I think is a positive development, frankly, because I think more investors were willing to take more meetings because they were, much faster kind of virtual Zoom meetings. So that allowed us to get to more investors. Mm-hmm. And frankly, on the East Coast, on the West Coast, but we also have European investors we were able to interact with via this virtual means. So I think that's been an advantage. And you can now raise capital faster and potentially at a lower cost because you don't have travel associated with it. So I think carrying that forward in this climate, one piece of advice is to go broad in terms of the number of investors that a new company would speak with. And this isn't only limited to investors in the US. I think there are great funds in Europe, there are great funds in Asia, and now with this more virtual fundraising concept, I think it allows companies to raise capital from investors across the world more easily. The other thing I would note, I think what I'm seeing is a lot of risk aversion of investors in this environment. And so what that means is that the story probably needs to be a little bit more advanced from a either preclinical or clinical perspective relative to what was needed in the last couple of years. So for those new companies that are starting, that are kind of maybe if they're spin-outs from academic labs, one piece of advice may be to ensure that you have a sufficient substrate of data that can attract the level of investment that you need to get to your next milestone. So what this could mean at the time is potentially some companies staying in the academic setting a little bit longer than they otherwise would, getting that validating data, and then going out to raise the capital after that. And that's an approach that could help to address some of the risk aversion that at least I'm seeing in the investment climate today.
Well, that's very good advice, and I think people are probably listening carefully because it is a challenging financial climate, and you need to do some extra in order to go raise capital. So let's talk about the disease areas that LEXEO is working on. Cardiovascular is one, and then CNS is another one, especially as it focused on Alzheimer's. So where do you currently stand with both those programs clinically, and what are you excited about? Yeah,
so as you mentioned, we have two distinct disease areas we're focused on as a company. The first is a focus in genetic cardiovascular diseases. This is led by a program treating the cardiac pathology of a disease called Friedreich's ataxia. We're currently in a phase 1/2 study for this indication. We've completed our first dose cohort. We're now into our second dose cohort. We're expecting to have a clinical data readout in the first half of 2024, which will give some very interesting insight into how the program is progressing and the impact that we're having on patients. Behind that program on the cardiovascular side, we have a program treating arrhythmogenic cardiomyopathy for which we expect to be in the clinic by the end of this year. So we have the potential to be the first company with 2 cardiovascular gene therapy programs in the clinic within this year. So that's really exciting for us because we see a lot of potential in the cardiovascular field, which I'll talk more about. On the other side, as you mentioned, we have a program focused on APOE4 homozygous Alzheimer's disease. And here we're delivering the APOE2 gene to the central nervous system of APOE4 homozygotes. We're currently in a phase 1/2 study for this indication. We expect to complete enrollment of the study this year, and we'll have a significant data readout associated with this program in 2024. We actually read out low-dose data associated with this program at an Alzheimer's conference last year, and we showed reduction in some of the key biomarkers that are commonly associated with Alzheimer's disease. So I think the early data is very interesting, and we're looking forward to the next data readout associated with that program.
And Alzheimer's disease has been one of those sort of, final frontiers, if you will, in terms of solving, people, not only solving the disease and treatment of Alzheimer's, but also delaying the progression and actually preventing it ultimately. And actually just this month, we've seen like 2 exciting gene therapies get FDA approval. One was for Alzheimer's disease and one for muscular dystrophy. So first, let's talk about Leqembi, right?
Yes.
That's the one which has been in the news lately because it got accelerated approval, and many feel that it may be short of the magic quote-unquote cure that we're all hoping for. Tell us a little bit about what you think about its benefits and why you think this drug was able to get through accelerated approvals through the FDA.
Yeah, so I think the developments in the Alzheimer's field over the last year have been more than the prior 10, so it's an exciting time for treatments in this disease area. Lecanemab, or Leqembi, was an important milestone for the Alzheimer's field in that it was accelerated approved several months ago. However, it was not fully reimbursed by Medicare. So this was one of the first times where we saw the accelerated approval of a product, but we did not see it, the corresponding reimbursement for that. And it's something we can talk about because it could be a troubling trend, and it could deter investment into the types of indications that would benefit from accelerated approvals. However, more recently, in the last couple of weeks, Leqembi has received a traditional approval, a full approval, which is another important milestone. And I think it does mean it will widen and open access to this therapy for patients now. So I think patients will be able to benefit from this treatment. I think what's interesting about this and other therapies that are utilizing a similar mechanism is that they have shown clinical benefit. They have shown an ability to slow the progression of the disease. But I think underneath the data for this program is another very interesting trend, is that patients of different genotypes respond differently to the therapy. So there's a gene called ApoE, apolipoprotein E. ApoE4s, which is the subset we're focused on, respond differently to this therapy than ApoE3s do. And the ApoE2s respond differently than ApoE4s as well. So what that means to us is that precision medicine is likely to play an important role in the Alzheimer's field. And we have a precision medicine in the form of a gene therapy that's targeting this ApoE4 population. And we think there remains a pretty substantial unmet need, despite the fact that there is now a treatment that exists for these patients. So, more to come with the data that we're producing, but we do feel that a precision medicine such as a gene therapy could have an important role in the Alzheimer's treatment landscape.
Yeah, it's interesting because the ApoE, proteins, 3 or 4 or what have you, you could actually get yourself tested and see if you're, right? And so you could predict if you're going to get Alzheimer's. How are companies dealing with that? How are patients dealing with understanding that actually down the road they are at potential risk for getting Alzheimer's? And how are companies like 23andMe and many other companies that are doing this kind of genetic testing dealing with this? Because there's a social aspect, there's a scientific aspect. Some people want to know, some people would rather not know.
Right. No, it's a great question, and I think it's one that's common to, certainly in the rare disease rare disease field. A lot of different individuals would like to know whether they have a certain predisposition to a certain disease. And this is one of the rare occasions where there's a larger disease where we have now found the genetic link between this ApoE gene and the likelihood of developing the disease. So it's a concept that's now expanding beyond rare disease and now into much larger diseases like Alzheimer's.
Yes.
And as you mentioned, 23andMe now has a panel to test for ApoE4, and which could confer a risk of 20 times higher than normal of developing Alzheimer's disease. So, why is that important? I think up until now, probably it didn't have much relevance because there wasn't a true treatment for Alzheimer's disease that was available. But I think as more treatments become available, it does make more sense for individuals to understand their genetic risk of developing the disease. And there are things that can be done both from a preventative point of view, lifestyle and other things that could potentially delay the onset of the disease if you do inherit that that genetic profile. Our therapy in particular is focused on ApoE4 homozygotes, so it also can help enable clinical research that can ultimately have a treatment or a cure for patients of that genotype. So I think it's an important step for the field to take in terms of beginning to think about the link between the genetics and the disease, and hopefully society in general embraces that concept and we do see more genetic testing, because this is actually what will usher in the therapies that will treat patients that do have that risk.
That risk. It's interesting because clinical trials, doing clinical trials in Alzheimer's disease, it's a bit of a conundrum, especially if you want to look at delaying progression.
Yes.
So let's say somebody knows that they are predisposed to Alzheimer's because they've taken a genetic test. And how likely is it that people like that will sign up for a clinical trial? Because it's still a risk. It's not like a deterministic.
Yeah.
So doing trials on healthy people who haven't yet had that, I mean, that must be a difficult task.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, there's been a single trial looking at a preventative therapy for Alzheimer's disease. I believe it was Roche who ran the study. But they're notoriously long and expensive, and what you mentioned, patients are often hesitant to enter into those types of studies. What I would see is the following. I think for a lot of families that do inherit the APOE4 gene, they will see a number of members of their families that will develop Alzheimer's disease. So their grandmother, their aunt, their uncle, and so on. So they'll see this disease across their family. So I think in those cases, a lot of individuals are motivated to consider, clinical trials, whether it's for a preventative therapy or it's for a treatment, because they are thinking about their children or their grandchildren and the impact that inheriting this gene will have on their family. So there is that inherent motivation to ensure that a therapy or preventative therapy exists because of the rest of their family that could benefit from it. But I would come back to, in at least the type of work we're doing in Alzheimer's disease, with this gene therapy that we're developing. First, we're developing it for patients who have developed symptoms of Alzheimer's disease, and that's the first focus. But theoretically, it has a potential as a preventative treatment, which would mean that with a single administration of gene therapy, you could potentially delay or halt the progression of Alzheimer's disease. And for someone who has not yet developed symptoms, this may allow them, to have a significant delay in terms of the development of their symptoms as well, what I'm saying is that a single administration could ultimately change the profile of a patient with a high risk to that of a much lower risk. And so it's not a burdensome treatment course, it's a single administration, 20-minute outpatient procedure. And I think treatments like that will potentially open the door to more prevention in this field, and ultimately that's what will have the biggest impact on the disease.
Wow, that raises so many questions, because on the one hand, that would be kind of quote unquote, miracle cure, right? Like, so you could actually take one, therapy and then, you're delaying the progression. But how do you deal with reimbursement and, pricing and cost and all of that? And we'll come back to that again. But from a cardiovascular standpoint, I understand that there's only 10 precision medicine therapies, and only 10 have been approved for treatment, and many of them for the same disease state. So with that being cardiovascular being one of the #1 killers, right, especially in women, I mean, where do you see the field heading, and where do you see the role of gene therapy in your program in it?
Yeah, so I think, we like to look at the cardiovascular treatment landscape and compare it to oncology. And what I see is that the cardiovascular treatment landscape is where oncology was almost 15 years ago, that there was a realization that, one-size-fits-all treatments may not treat a very complex disease, and that you actually need to break these diseases into their genetic components and then apply precision therapies to treat them. And today what we're seeing is in oncology, 50-60% of the treatments in oncology are precision medicines. As you mentioned, in the cardiovascular treatment landscape, we have less than 10 precision medicines. So in our view, the cardiovascular treatment landscape will evolve in a lot of the same way that it has evolved in oncology, that we will break these cardiovascular diseases into their genetic components and apply precision therapies to treat them. Now, at the moment, the most efficient way to deliver, let's say, a genetic payload to the heart is through adeno-associated virus, through AAV vectors, so through gene therapy. So we have been advancing a pipeline of gene therapies that are aimed at treating these genetic cardiovascular diseases. We have one in the clinic. We have a second that will be in the clinic by the end of this year. I think today we have one of the deepest pipelines in cardiac genetic medicine out there today. And as I mentioned, it's a field that we think will grow and advance over time. And I think as we begin to see these larger one-size-fits-all treatments reach loss of exclusivity, I think the entire industry will be looking at what's next in the cardiovascular field. It's our view that precision medicine and cardiac will be the future of this disease area.
You spoke about delivering the payload to the heart. What about the brain, right? Back to the Alzheimer's program, because I mean, there's a blood-brain barrier,
Yeah.
and like delivering something to the brain has always been a big, huge issue.
Yeah.
So how do you do that?
Yeah, so there's two approaches for gene therapy. One is that today there are viral vectors emerging that can pass through the blood-brain barrier. So there are IV administered capsids that can ultimately get to the brains. They have that kind of tropism profile, and these are very exciting for the future, in particular for larger diseases. But the alternate route is through an actual central nervous system route of administration.
Wow.
So an actual needle at the in the back of the brain or in a lumbar puncture, and this ultimately allows the viral vector to get into the brain and transduce the brain. Now it sounds probably more difficult than it is.
Yeah.
In the case of the therapy that we're developing, it's a single administration, 20-minute outpatient procedure. It's a very quick procedure and not significantly invasive, and that allows us to get the vector into the brain.
That's great. Now, I want to go back to precision medicine. So you're working on precision medicine, and so on the one hand, that's what we want,
Yes.
right? A personalized medicine at the end of the day.
Yeah.
But how do we tackle the reimbursement question?
Yeah, you know, it's a challenging one, but I do see a light at the end of the tunnel that can benefit both society and our industry. And as I think about, and I'll give an example, a recently approved gene therapy treating hemophilia B. So this is Unicure's therapy was, I think, priced in the above $3 million, which is the most expensive medicine that's ever been approved or ever been commercialized in the world. But this medicine is replacing the current treatment for hemophilia B, which is a recombinant factor replacement. And a recombinant factor replacement for hemophilia B could cost the healthcare system every single year for a single patient between $600,000 a year and $800,000 a year. So if you take that $3+ million price and you divide it by the annual treatment cost of the existing therapeutic option, and you look at past year 5, at year 6, year 7, and then for the rest of the patient's life, this patient ultimately, because it's a single administration, almost a functional cure to the disease via the gene therapy, this patient becomes a very low cost for the healthcare system. So in a way, by treating these patients with gene therapy, you can almost move this disease off the balance sheet of the healthcare system or from society in general. So that's a very substantial change in how we would think about therapeutics in the future if with cell and gene therapy or gene editing or other modalities like this, we can completely offer functional cures to diseases. We could have diseases that society no longer needs to pay for.
Yeah.
So the question is, are we looking at cost over the right time horizon? If you look at costs in a single year, yes, it's a $3 million treatment, but if you look at it over 5 years or 10 years, you start to see pretty substantial savings versus alternative treatment options. So what I like to think is that I believe what society wants from our industry is cures to diseases. They want hopefully a single administration, and they never have to think about the disease again. The technology to enable that is here. This is cell and gene therapy, gene editing, other technologies of this type. So I just think we need to come up with the payment and reimbursement structures that can allow us to develop these therapies and can allow them to proliferate across society.
Is there enough knowledge in the payer community that about the pharmacoeconomics of single administration therapies versus what it costs the healthcare system with standard of care?
I think so. I think that the U.S. payers are relatively sophisticated in understanding this. I just think there haven't been enough therapies in this area, whether cell and gene therapies, that are treating larger patient populations, such that we need to change or reform the system in order to accommodate it.
Yeah.
But I think, for example, with the introduction of Sarepta's Duchenne's muscular dystrophy therapy and potentially some others that are coming, like BioMarin's hemophilia A treatment, these patient populations are large enough that I think payers will have to say, well, I need a alternate approach to pay for these medicines. And I think with the increased number of gene therapies, treating an increased number of patients, it will create a burden that will cause payers to reform the system. And so I think it'll come from need. They'll need to sort of change their approaches in order to accommodate these types of medicines. And if we look forward 10, 20 years, I would see a substantial number of these therapies being commercialized. And so society must adapt, payers must adapt to accommodate them. The need will be too great for that type of work.
Plus, can you imagine like the healthy society, like you're moving from like being sick for a long time and going through therapy after therapy to like, a single administration, the so-called functional cure, as you said, which is what people would rather choose, right?
Absolutely.
And so we talked a little bit about accelerated approvals. What is your sort of philosophy in general about accelerated approvals? We saw that during COVID-19, when we had the accelerated approval and emergency use authorization, a lot of people did not want to take the vaccines because they were not sure it had gone through all the checks and balances.
Yeah. So I think, COVID was a unique circumstance. This is one of the first times where a population of this size, potentially billions of people globally, would receive a vaccine that was accelerated approved. In most cases, accelerated approvals are used for the types of diseases and the types of treatments where there is no alternative, where there's high unmet need. It's a life-threatening disease, or like different cancers or different rare diseases. And so I think in a lot of cases, patients are highly motivated to consider a treatment option that has gone through an accelerated approval pathway because there is no other treatment for them. And that's actually what it was designed for. It originally came from the AIDS HIV crisis and the need from that community to have treatments that were available to them. So if I look at it in that context, I think patients that are interested in medicines that are accelerated approved typically do want them, and they typically are interested in having them. The question is just, will we continue to see them reimbursed in the same way that medicines that are traditionally approved are reimbursed? And I think that's one of the challenges of what we saw in the Alzheimer's field, was that the accelerated approved treatments had reimbursement barriers placed in front of them, so patients weren't really able to access them. And this was a little bit of a concerning trend, which I hope does not continue, because the types of medicines that are approved through accelerated approvals are the types of medicines that I hope society says we want the biopharmaceutical industry to develop. Instead of the 15th treatment for another broader disease, we want the industry to focus on a disease like Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, where there is no treatment and it's life-threatening, and every day counts for these patients.
Yeah. One other question for you. Are you looking into cardiovascular therapeutics, or as a field in general, for various ethnic communities of color, who might have some distinct different, needs there?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's an important element of this. An example I'd give, there's a therapy that's being commercialized now called tafamidis that treats transthyretin amyloid cardiomyopathy, which is a rare, cardiovascular disease. In the U.S., there's a substantial portion of the population with this disease that are African American. And the reason for this is that a certain gene called V122I is a gene that's inherited through the African American community. And this community, ultimately, this gene confers the risk of TTR amyloid cardiomyopathy. So that's an example of a certain rare disease which has a genetic predisposition in the African American community, and that the treatment tafamidis in a way is aimed at beginning to address some of that challenge. And so I think we would see similar trends if we looked at other cardiovascular diseases. It may not be the African American community, it may be others, but I think as we look at the genetics and the link of the genetics and the disease, we'll typically see them run through certain ethnic groups. And so I think the TTR example with the African American community is one. And it's a good place, and it's a good analog for what we may be able to do in other diseases.
Well, thank you so much, Nolan. It was great talking to you, and thanks for the great work that you do. And we're so excited to have you here as part of the CURE community.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.